Okay, everyone. So I'm going to welcome you back to the third day of public art now. So for those of you who are only joining us today, my name is Dr. Grania Coughlin and I'm the coordinator of this event. So again, just to welcome you all here, and we hope you enjoyed the last two sessions. So throughout many of the sessions over the last 2 days, we have focused our attention on different examples of public art practice and models of and for its production. However, the development of public art from the point of view of the artist as well as the commissioners also requires careful consideration of the different social, political and cultural contexts with which the work of art intersects. As such, today's session opens up discussion to the assumptions, philosophies and theories underpinning our understanding of public art. So this morning's session, Theories of Public Art, will explore and consider questions of aesthetics and value in the contemporary practice of public art. It will approach these from a variety of perspectives: philosophy, cultural democracy, and the labor involved for practitioners and beholders. So before I hand you over to Dr. Connell Vaughn, who will be chairing our session, just once again, a reminder to make sure that your mic is muted. We hope you have many questions for our panelists. So whenever you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which is down the bottom of your Zoom screen. And our chair will get to these either throughout or at the end of the session. If you'd like to drop in a link or a resource that you think might be useful to other attendees, please use the chat function also at the bottom of the screen for this. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Dr. Connell Vaughn. So Connell is a philosopher and programme chair of the Creative Industries and Visual Culture degree at TU Dublin. He is an associate researcher with the Graduate School of Creative Arts and Media, a committee member of the European Society for Aesthetics, and a member of the Aesthetics Research Group. So over to you, Connell.
Thank you, Grania. Welcome, everybody. Good morning from Dublin. So today we're going to speak about the theories, and obviously we're going to relate this as well to cultural policy and the practice of contemporary public art. And our speakers and our panelists today are Eleanor Belfiore, who is Professor of Communication and Media Studies and the co-director of the Centre for Research in Communication and Culture at Loughborough University. She has published extensively on cultural politics and policy, and particularly the place that notions of the social impacts of the arts have had in British cultural policy discourses. She was co-director of studies of the Warwick Commission on the Future of Cultural Value and co-author of its final report, Enriching Britain, Culture, Creativity and Growth. This was published in 2015. For Palgrave, she edits the book series New Directions in Cultural Policy Research, and she is co-editor-in-chief for the journal Cultural Trends. Dr. Marnie Badham has a 25-year history of art and social justice in work in these areas in Australia and Canada. Her research sits at the intersection of socially engaged art, particularly research methodologies, and the politics of cultural measurement. She is Senior Research Fellow at the School of Art, and she leads the Contemporary Art and Social Transformation Research Group and the Cultural Value Impact Network at the University in Melbourne, Australia. And last but not least is Dr. Elisa Calderola, who's a research fellow in philosophy at the University of Padua in Italy, where she specializes in analytic aesthetics and the philosophy of art. Her work focuses on installation art and situated art, on conceptual art, and on the philosophy of museums, on depiction and the meta-ontology of art. In 2018, she received a STARS grant from the University of Padua for her research project, A Philosophy of Art Installation, and her work has appeared in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Ergo, Open Philosophy and Aesthesis. In 2020, she published a monograph, Philosophy of Contemporary Art, Installation, Site and Object. So, welcome everybody. And so we might begin by asking Elisa maybe to kind of begin with a kind of definitional question as we're wont to do in questions of theory. And Elisa, you've done much work on kind of mapping the field, particularly of installation art, from a kind of philosophical perspective. So how are we to begin to even categorize, or would we say, because we're going to come on to this question of measurement, to even count public art? I mean, it's clearly more than something that's kind of simply kind of plopped outside a building, or even an art institution. So it's more than this kind of the tangible monument. So what kind of art would you say is public art?
So first of all, hello everybody, and thanks for having me here. So public art, well, I guess the short answer would be it is art that is in public space, but this is a bit of a poor answer, because what does this mean, we could ask. And well, let's try and look at some intuitions that perhaps some of us might share about what it does not mean for an artwork to be in public space. So it seems to be that perhaps an artwork that is placed in a remote site, as it happens with many so-called destination artworks, doesn't really qualify as a work that is in public space. So I don't know, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, for instance, that sits on the shore of the Great Salt Lake, perhaps doesn't really qualify as a public artwork. And another kind of artwork that probably wouldn't qualify as public is, for instance, an artwork that is sited in an urban setting, so not in a remote setting, but is remote nevertheless, because it is really, really out of reach. So suppose it is installed on the rooftop of a building that is public, but isn't really used by so many people, or perhaps even by nobody. So again, this seems somehow in tension with the notion of an artwork being public. And then we could try and qualify this notion of public art, thinking of whether it applies only to works that are located in publicly owned spaces. And this again seems to be a poor requirement, in that it is perhaps too strict. Sometimes we have a feeling that a place is public because we share it with many other people and we go there all the time, and there are no specific impediments for us to enter that space and live in it. But from a legal viewpoint, that space might well, belong to, for instance, a corporation. So again, perhaps it's a place that for some reason has to feel public. And finally, we could say, well, it is then very important to public art that it has to be publicly authorized, institutionally authorized in some way. But this, again, at least to some theorists, would seem too strict a requirement, because it would exclude the whole realm of street art, or of at least that kind of street art that is definitely not authorized. And we could argue whether all genuine street art has to be unauthorized or not. So in order to, try and put together all those intuitions and clarify the concept of public art, I think we could follow a suggestion that has been put forward by a colleague of mine, philosopher Mary Beth Willard, who has recently argued that, public art is art that has to be accessible to the public, where accessible in the physical sense means that the public that is meant to experience it can regularly stumble upon it, so to speak, rather than being required to look for it, to have the specific intention of, going out and look for an artwork to experience. And so this is very different from what usually happens when we enter a museum in order to experience artworks. And then another interesting insight I would like to borrow from Willard is the fact that public art also has to be epistemically accessible, as we would say in somewhat philosophical jargon, meaning that it has to be addressed to a public that possesses already the information that is key, that is relevant to appreciate the work as the kind of work it is. So, for instance, imagine a busker who plays a dodecaphonic piece of music at a metro station somewhere in the world. So it's quite unlikely that that kind of performance of a piece of music is going to qualify as a public artwork, because although it is performed in a public space, its musical qualities are so rarefied, so extremely in need of a very fine musical education in order to be appreciated, that they are unlikely to be appealing to the broad public that we can encounter at a metro station, for instance. And the last thing I'm going to say is that along with this requirement of physical and epistemical accessibility, there probably goes also a requirement of what I would call sightedness. So public artworks have to be integrated in a publicly accessible space. They don't just have to sit there. You can't just plop some, big monumental object in a square and thereby produce a public artwork. You have to produce something that has a link to its physical site that is such that it makes a difference for the content of the work. And probably we could discuss about whether this site has to be, strictly speaking, physical. I guess we should definitely make room for public art that can be made on the internet, on virtual sites. But some sense of sites, I believe, has to be maintained in order for a work to qualify as a public artwork.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. That was a really good way to to begin to think about, what's at stake, and kind of even just conceptualizing what is or what could count as public art, because you've brought in some of the obvious questions around, space and location and site, but also these other things which we probably don't think of enough, which is ownership, authorship, but also the different ways of thinking around accessibility. Accessibility isn't simply just who can, attend to the work, but also like how kind of comprehensible the work could be for a kind of a public audience. So maybe if we just have a kind of a quick kind of follow-up on this, will be to think about, when we bring, and to really to think about this question of accessibility, because there does seem to be a tension here, because when we, and I think the tension is by combining the words public and art in a sense, because we don't usually bring accessibility as a requirement to thinking about art. That's actually sometimes forbidden, when thinking about art, that it should be accessible. So is there an inherent tension that you see, Elisa, in the idea of public art itself? Should it, could it require a different name perhaps?
So I don't know whether the tension is inherent. Okay. I think I have to do much more work on this, to be honest. But there are definitely, I think, at least two sources of tension that I can identify from my viewpoint. So one is that, well, at least in the Western tradition, at least in the modern Western tradition, we are used to think about art as an affair between an artist and artwork and a subject. Whereas here we are dealing with a plurality of subjects. And maybe later we will discuss about how to characterize this plurality of subjects, but because there's a lot to say about that as well. It's probably not just, a mere set of people who are together for no reason. And so there is this tension, this idea that probably it's not enough to focus on our own private, someone would say subjective experience of the art object in order to appreciate it if this object has this public dimension. And then the other source of tension that I see is that at least some views of art, maybe they are a bit naive, but they tend to depict the production of artwork as a kind of, I don't know, putting a message in a bottle, I would say, where one doesn't really have to care too much about who is going to read the message. The message is there, and perhaps someone will one day read it. And this model doesn't really seem to be working if we consider public art, because it seems that the artist, whoever produces the thing that we decide to call artwork, needs to have some idea of the public they're going to address at the very time they are producing the artwork. So it's probably public art is a form of art that puts some more constraints on how artists operate. I'm not sure whether there is like a contradiction between the concept of art making and the concept of art making in the public. I'm inclined to say no, but there definitely is a tension, I think.
Excellent, thanks. I think that, you know, that image you use of the message in a bottle is very rich, and it kind of allows us to think that there's some kind of responsibility or service requirement in public art. Maybe we could bring in Marnie here to kind of allow us to develop this further by thinking of what, you know, you describe as the kind of the affair. And Marnie, I know that you've done kind of interesting work on particularly the nature of the labor of public art. Maybe we could kind of bring that in as well. So I'm thinking in terms of, you know, these terms that we use, you know, participation, you've talked about, or you've looked at residencies, and kind of maybe even the issues around sustainability and ephemerality. Yesterday, for example, we had examples of gardens as public art. You know, could you speak of the current trend of kind of funding that kind of influences these practices of public work that kind of can reactivate public space in the context that we're in now? You know, we think of the pandemic, we think of the climate crisis and so on.
Sure, many things to talk about there, Connell. Thanks, and thanks, Eliza, for that wonderful introduction for us to build on. Also, thanks and hello to everybody from Melbourne, Australia, calling in from the beautiful lands of the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on here in Melbourne. And recognize that sovereignty was never ceded here. So I think that's particularly important when I'm going into an international context, but also talking about publics and place. So thinking about, you know, histories and significance of connection to land and to country. So you may notice from my accent, I'm actually from Canada. So I'm an uninvited guest here in Australia. But I think what's important also to preface the conversation is that, you know, Canada and Australia obviously have particular geopolitical histories that are different than where you're all zooming in from today as well. So I think that the trends both in art making and policy making are informed from those specificities as well. So I moved to Australia, I guess about 15 years ago, because I was very much interested in some of the shared histories of the countries around socially engaged art practice, community-based practice, and art in public space. So I use that term art in public space, not only because it's the program we teach into at RMIT University, but it also provides a broader framework to think as an expansive practice that may be rooted in a history of public art in terms of monuments, or what we might, you know, tongue-in-cheek call plonk art. which were meant to be permanent, historical works that could be shared symbolism and meaning for communities. But as we all know, public space is increasingly contested in many, many different ways, and particularly with COVID, there's a need to reconnect to being in the open space and with others in that space, in publics. So my framework really focuses on socially engaged art, context responsive art, and increasingly in Melbourne, which has a long history of very established public artworks, but also performance. And a whole range of interventions in the public and social realm. So in terms of policy, both Canada and Australia and most Western countries and policies obviously see art as a public good since the 80s, and I'm sure Ellie can talk much more about this than I can. But thinking about that sort of public good and the democratization of arts practices. But I guess, fast forward to this year, in Melbourne, we're seeing increased support from local governments and federal governments around more immediate interactions and activations of public space, including festivals and other types of public artwork, like artworks on trams driving through the city, projections in the city, and other ways to make meaning. So when I think about socially engaged art, I'm very much interested in this idea of aligning it with the public art framework around that it's not simply, as Eliza said, this affair between the artist and her subject, with an audience, viewing it. Now it becomes a negotiation between artists, institutions, communities of interest and specificity, but also a much broader public. So my research these days is very much around those sorts of compromises and negotiations that happen between those different stakeholders in the commissioning of new works. Sometimes we find this to be a very complicated relationship. Firstly, with some recent work that I'm working on with an Australian Research Council funded grant called Ambitious and Fair, Sustainable Strategies for the Visual Arts Sector, really looks at not only artists' incomes, but all of the different frameworks and structures that are set up between artists and those that mediate their work with the public. So there's a lot of questions around labor remuneration, but also that emotional labor and other forms of labor that happen in these negotiations when the artist may experience an unequal power balance with the commissioners and bodies that are in charge of mediating their work with the public. I might talk a little bit about residencies in thinking about what this means in public space. So again, I'm interested in socially engaged practice where artists are working in a particular context, like public art, which might be site or community, I guess you would say. And socially engaged art, as I think there's sort of a shared understanding of what that is now, is really about artists engaging with people, place, and often power structures and publics to identify and affect local particular social issues, which may look like political action, but is driven by aesthetic sensibility. And I think with this expanded notion of public art, that's actually a definition that we could use here. So as public space becomes more contested, policed, surveilled, there's important implications for socially engaged art, public art, to speak to a broader audience in assisting and recreating shared meaning for the local places where we can feel comfortable together. In Australia in particular, I see two sort of major emphasis on public art commissioning, including socially engaged art and other forms of engaged practice. Firstly, the voices of Indigenous artists and traditional custodians of the land are increasingly being privileged and are involved in large-scale public artworks and commissions, extending our understanding of place and connection to country and sovereignty. Some might say this is a way of thinking through symbolic reparations, actually, for colonization and what can be described as genocide through colonization in Australia. On the other hand, the area that we're seeing more and more work is artists thinking about sustainability in their work, which is in both form and in content. I think commissioners are also thinking about this. So public artworks are now only commissioned for up to 15 years, if that. Sorry, a permanent artwork is only 15 years. So through our research with this larger grant, we've done a lot of work looking at the best practices and how those policies across local governments and other commissioning frameworks actually vary. We're not lucky enough to have that percent for art scheme here. So it's a new negotiation every time. I'm particularly interested in works these days that are artworks, not just for communities, but for more than human audiences, artworks that are experienced by the environment and have an interaction with that site, which exists with or without a human audience. And then I guess finally, we're seeing a huge influx of public artworks and commissioning in response to disaster as well. So, you know, some of the early artworks that I was interested in include, you know, Paul Chan's Waiting for Godot after Hurricane Katrina in the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that work, but Paul Chan is an incredible socially engaged artist. Kato in Japan, following the Fukushima disaster, had an incredible artwork entitled 11.1 Project, which was this lovely coming together of community to collect the materials of lighthouses that had fallen to their demise, and the recreation of new collective monuments with 100 fishermen in that community pulling that together. In Australia, a whole series of artworks in response to, as I said, Indigenous genocide, but also bushfires more recently in some of the areas that I work in around Melbourne as well. And these monuments are functioning in very different ways. They are, you know, huge life-size trees with hundreds of beautiful steel worker-made leaves in the names of people that have passed away. But there's also more symbolic gathering spaces for people to come together and memorialize their community members that they've lost. So really interesting movements in public art in Australia these days.
Thanks, Marnie. There's so much to take from that. I was really struck at the beginning, and I apologize, I named your university incorrectly. It's the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology at the beginning. But there's so much to take from that, and I think the first thing that struck me was the that rewording of the topic from public art to art in public space, because that allows us to see the object in a very different way, or the topic in a different way. And then you discussed how, you know, there is and I'm sure Eleonora can speak about this, the growing idea of art as a public good and the kind of instrumentalization of art in that sense. But also we might think of, if it's art in a public space, it requires us to think about public space itself as a public good, or space as a public good. And this, certainly in the current context, is something that is made quite clear to us. You know, the role that space is, whether someone has a garden or not, for example, it makes a world of difference in lockdown. So, you know, we have these classic distinctions of oikos and demos. You know, we have these other distinctions of the public and the private, and it requires us to kind of think about how we might reconceive of public art, or art, as you say, in the public space, in the context of the pandemic. I mean, like art is possible, certainly. That kind of classic affair that Elisa described is certainly possible, but is public art possible in lockdown? You know, is it possible on Zoom to bring in that other site that Elisa mentioned? I'm aware that you kind of used other terms that we hadn't discussed yet, which is the idea of certainly time. And I think we should just park that for a moment to come back to time. But the other term you used was scale as well. Could you maybe say a few words on whatever I've rambled on about there?
Maybe. Maybe. Time and scale. I guess what I'm seeing with my short history of understanding public art is that time and scale has changed, I think, for public art, which, you know, used to be, you know, a hero on a horse or a large, you know, more abstract monument, modernist sort of style as well, which I still love. But I think the interpretation of what public art is very, very different. It's not just about an artwork that fits in a public square. It's actually artworks that create meaning and significance about place in a different way, including creating spaces for people to gather or to gather around. Let's meet at the Birrarung Mar public sculpture along the river. Let's meet, you know, on the steps of the train station. Let's meet in these sorts of spaces. During COVID, there was, particularly as a lecturer in public art and socially engaged art, there was a whole new public as well, which was our online audiences, which Eliza referred to. But absolutely, we, I think, really need to reconsider what we understand as public, which is not necessarily the same social contract that we have within the art gallery.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to think about, as has been mentioned already, the kind of the plurality of publics that, you know, we see, and how these can be mediated by certain, you know, contexts, but also technologies as well. I'm conscious that it's we haven't had Eleonora speak yet, so maybe Eleonora, if you'd like to turn on your microphone there, and maybe if you could speak to this kind of relationship between the kind of different trends that you've studied in terms of policy advocacy in public art, and how you see the relationship between the kind of, again, we've seen that as the idea of the public good, or the kind of questions that we have around value and impact that are often used to justify what kind of gets not just installed, but like commissioned, what gets produced, and in terms of the question of time, what gets restored and what gets retained, we might say. And we've also had Marnie brought up the question as well about cultural democracy, you know, and, you know, there's that trend of, or that debate between the democratization of culture and cultural democracy as well.
Yes. Wow, Connell, lots to unpack there. But I certainly think that whilst I haven't particularly focused on public art in relation to my work on policy, I think it's beyond question that public art, like many other forms of art and cultural production, which at least to a degree relies on public support, has been suffering from what I have referred to in my writing as justification anxiety. And that sense of having to be able to articulate a sense of its own value in terms that not just the experts in that field will accept as valid and understand and agree upon, which already would be hard enough, but in a way that the public more widely and the policymakers and decision makers can agree upon. And in terms of understanding what the challenge here is, I always use this quote. And last night, as I was thinking about the questions that we were going to discuss today, I did a masterclass for students yesterday, students in Scotland, PhD students, about the value and impact of humanities research, which is a question that follows quite closely the kind of arguments of the longer similar debates around the art. And I always use a quote to explain what the problem is, which I find very helpful. And this is a quote from a member of the public who left a comment on the BBC Newsnight comment page. And I don't know how well BBC programmes are known in Ireland, but BBC Newsnight is an evening news and commentary on the news programme. It's a flagship sort of political commentary programme for the BBC. And in 2008, in December 2008, when the full extent of the financial crash started to become clear, BBC Newsnight had an episode that focused on the art, but the question was framed in terms of, it's now clear that things are bad. They are, from an economic financial point of view, they are worse than we thought at first they might be. It's clear that we are going to enter a time of austerity. A time of austerity, incidentally, that we never seem to have gotten out of, but you know, that's a different story, a different debate. So cuts will have to happen. And so Newsnight framed the question is, so where do we start saving? Should we start from the arts? Or should we keep supporting them even in tough time? And so they invited the public to comment on this question. And a chap whose username was Tom Nightingale posted a very interesting comment, which I will now read out. So he said, there are strong cases for publicly funding street lighting, hospitals, schools, and many other goods and services. What is the value of arts beyond private enjoyment? I, and many others, enjoy fish and chips. Should chippies be subsidised? A bag of fish and chips beats the pants off anything either Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst ever produced. And I think there are two ways that you can react to Tom Nightingale's comment. I think one would be to just roll your educated eyes and just think, oh my God, one more example of the Philistine spirit that runs through the, you know, the great British public, and dismiss this as, you know, an ignorant comment, which I fear might be a position that some in the arts world might take. I don't think that's acceptable. I think it would be arrogant and patronizing to dismiss this question, because actually the other way that you can look at this is that what Tom Nightingale is raising here is actually a series of philosophical questions which might not have been articulated in the sophisticated language that, for instance, Elisa has used for us at the beginning, but they kind of point in the same kind of direction. So what Tom Nightingale is really asking is, we know that there are things that make the world better, that make the world easier to live in for everyone, that ease people's difficulties, that support them when they're ill. And we all recognize that that's good. And so we are all willing to chip in to support these things. what has art done to demonstrate that it needs or it deserves similar treatment? And I think that's what I refer to as justification anxiety, that actually in 2021, it's not easy to come up with a convincing, compelling answer to what I call the Tom Nightingale challenge, in a way that that can be persuasive to people whose everyday life is not, constructed around being an artist or studying the arts, for the general public. And I think that's the crux of the advocacy problem. How do you convince Tom Nightingale and those who, like him, don't immediately see that public good, public merit of the arts? And I think public art has a particular challenge because, as we just talked, it's out there. So if its value, if its worth is not immediately evident, it's going to, and that's why public art has historically been where a lot of the controversies have focused on, because it's in public, because Tom Nightingale will have to, look at it every day when he walks, to his chippy or whatever. And so it's very hard for public art to deflect these kind of questions, I think. And so from a cultural policy perspective, this becomes the big problem of making the case for arts funding. For how do you argue that in times of austerity, in which we seem to have been permanently stuck, when the total sum of resources available for public services of the kind that Tom Nightingale cites and even more gets reduced all the time, how do you argue for part of this funding to go to various forms of art, including public art, when really every pound and every penny, every euro that goes to the art is a pound, a penny, or a euro that doesn't go to something else? And I think in a democracy, this is actually quite a fundamental question. And I think it's also one that is absolutely legitimate to ask, and B, is also one that we as a public can expect the art sector to respond to properly, without sort of rolling their eyes and dismissing that question as Philistine. And I think this is where you find instrumentalism creeping in, because and I like this quote from Richard Oggett's The Way We Live Now. And of course, Richard Oggett, apart from being one of the founding fathers of British cultural studies, was also heavily involved in arts funding. He was chairman of the Arts Council for a long time, so he'd been at the coalface of trying to deal with all these questions. And in the Way We Live Now, he talks about this experience of sort of being involved in arts funding, and he says quite simply, and I'm quoting, "There will never be enough money." So he says there's no rosy scenario in which you can imagine a time where we will have enough money to fund all that is deserving of funding. So he then says, and I'm quoting again, "Choices will always have to be made, judgments between." So every single policy decision, funding decision, is a judgment between. And I think that's what the art sector has a hard time justifying, why in judgment between they should come up trump and be the thing that is funded. And I think that's when you get instrumentalism and all those arguments, because this is a difficult question. It's a question that comes to how we allocate value, who in society has the cultural authority of deciding what, of making those judgments between and making the resulting decisions and allocation of scarce resources. And therefore, I think that's where the instrumentalism seems to offer a way forward, because it takes those difficult questions away from the arena of values, hierarchy of values, cultural authority, contestation, and it seems to lift them to a neutral place. And so I've got another little quote. So I collect these. So this is just one that I have chosen because it's short, but it's not even the most preposterous one, as I think I should say. But in 2013, the Local Government Association in the UK published a report entitled "Driving Growth Driving Growth Through Local Government Investment in the Arts," which, is a title that already tells you a lot about how policymakers have decided to tackle the Tom Nightingale challenge. And so this report had lots of examples of where investment seems to become an obvious matter of, it makes economic sense. So, even Tom Nightingale will see that this is good, these are good decisions. So this is a quote. York Museum Trust, which is the sort of body that funds various museums and sort of cultural institutions in the York area. So York Museum Trust represents a return of investment of around £10 sterling of impact for every £1 invested by City of York Council. Now, who would argue with you put £1 in, you get 10 back? Not even Tom Nightingale. So maybe you can't explain to him why a piece of art that might give joy to a small percentage of the population, which very inconveniently tends to be also a very white, wealthy, educated part of the population. But, how do you, instead of having to explain why that is somehow worth more or brings more valuable joy than a portion of chips, you can just say, Tom, look, it's easy. You put one in, when you put £1 in, you get £10 back. As a nerdy scholar, my problem is that there is no indication in this report of who has done this calculation, what methodology has been used, what does it mean, a return, what kind of impact are we talking about here? Is it net impact? Is it gross impact? Because, it makes a difference. So from, if you are an economist, this sentence doesn't mean anything. But to somebody who's not an economist, sounds good. He's a winner. Who's going to argue with a tenfold return of investment? And so what I think instrumentalism does, and that's why I call it defensive instrumentalism, it makes really awkward questions into much more easily dealt with technical and methodological questions of impact measurement. But it's a cop-out, and indeed they don't work, because one thing, so I've been charting these, Connell, and the more time passes, the more the pressure is on to make, to deal with the justification anxiety. And so the numbers start to rise. So it all started with, I remember being horrified when I was listening to some discussions around the Liverpool City of Culture before it started, and projections that every pound put in would, return £8. But now that everything has happened, a recent report looking back at Liverpool City of Culture in 2008 suggested that for every pound the city council put in, they got 12 back. And I give it 6 months before we get another report that says that you put in £1 and you get 15. Because you see, how much return is enough? Who knows? But I think that, those questions of value, authority, the sort of public nature of public art, and the fact that the public needs to see that value, to feel that that's an important part of their living environment, they're not going to go away.
I think it's interesting. You began with the Richard Hogger quote that there's never going to be enough, and it's never going to be enough. The 1 for 15, it's interesting to kind of see it's never going to be enough that way as well. I'm interested. Yet people do. We have certainly got an awareness of BBC in Ireland, but I'm not sure about in other places. What I think is fascinating about the Nightingale quote, and I think it's amazing that he's kind of been elevated to theorist status in our chat, and appropriately so as well, because it is an important challenge. I think what was interesting about it was the examples that he selected were not examples that we would normally or immediately describe as being examples of public art, and he uses that term as private art as well, private appreciation. And I think that goes back to something that perhaps if we think about instrumentalization as being something you can sell, there's also the word public is kind of something you can sell. Well, if it's public, it's not that bad. And I think that kind of, and it's that issue of distance as well. That I don't know, did Elisa want to come in on that? Did you have a comment? I thought you had your hand up for a second. Do you want to? No, okay. Okay, but I think, that's definitely another way to think about kind of what's at stake in the kind of the publicness of this, because it seems to me that, yes, you can make an argument about selling it if it's got some economic return on an investment, which is not perhaps the healthiest way to think about art per se, but you can also sell public art as being, well, it's for the public, I think people are certainly more receptive to that. It's not in the building of the institution. It's out there in public, and I can like it. And it seems to me that there is almost like an inherent investment that everyone has in what is public art, and what public art is in their environment. Everyone has an opinion. I know from my own experience, I grew up in a town in the west of Ireland, and the largest sculpture that was installed when I grew up there was a statue of Icarus. And my uncle was just completely baffled by this. He was like, how did Icarus fight for Ireland? That was his, what did he ever do? And that statue has subsequently been removed, but there was an investment. If I was to ever ask him for an opinion on any other work of art, I wouldn't get a response, but there was an investment there. So I wonder what you kind of make about
Yeah. I agree. I think it's an interesting point. And also another interesting point about the Tom Nightingale quote is that when he wants to criticize the idea of public subsidy of culture and arts, he's picked two artists who I wouldn't consider necessarily as the best representatives of publicly funded arts. They're very successful commercial artists. But I think this is another part of the problem, which is that I don't think the art sector has been very effective in communicating to the public the nature of what publicly funded art is. So I'm not sure that it's clear that distinction between public art and private commercial art in the public, certainly not in Tom Nightingale's mind, but I don't think that is, I think that that's a broader issue than just this one person. And so I think there's a job's worth there in terms of facilitating a better public understanding of what public support for the arts, also to trying to bring arts to the public and creating art that belongs in a sense to the public means. But in terms of the other point that you raised, and I love the example of the Icarus statue in your hometown, is that I think your uncle had a point, because in a sense, if you look at the history of public art, and again, I'm not an expert, but it had a very strong ideological function about expressing sanctioned official readings of history and the values behind history and national identity. I mean, I am Italian, and I remember as a young kid visiting Rome and being sort of stunned in a kind of slightly disturbed way by Piazza Venezia and all this, you know, majestic, imposing, fascist public art, where you don't need a degree in art history to get the ideological value of that kind of public art. So I think if you want the, and you know, at the time where a lot of, think about Trafalgar Square in London. I mean, at that point, I don't think that the public were called to have an opinion necessarily on public art. That was a clear message. And the thing is, if we want to live in a world where people engage with public art and they feel they're part of that conversation around what it means and why it's there, you know, and what has Icarus done for Ireland, then I think you need to accept that with that engagement will come contestation, and that you can't just, you know, chuck aesthetic value at people and, or, you know, oh my God, you know, but, you know, or some kind of hugely complex metaphor, or just expect them that they will be able to make some kind of metaphorical connection between, I don't know, Icarus and the ambition of Ireland. I don't know, because actually I don't have a clue what, you know, why, you know, the backstory to that statue. But I think, you know, if we want democracy in the public cultural realm, then we have to accept that with that comes a legitimate contestation of cultural authority. We're just telling people, you don't understand about art. It's just not enough, not acceptable.
Yes, and maybe we could bring Marnie in here to talk about this as well.
I'm bursting to jump in on the conversation because, as you know, Ellie, I'm a proud flag flyer of cultural democracy and even dissensus. And I actually think that public art is a really exciting opportunity for the expression and exchange of different values. In a minute, I might bring in my one slide for the presentation, and I'm really interested to hear from both Eliza and Ellie on this slide. But I did want to tell you about a recent experience, well, a project I'm working on currently. We had applied for some funding with a local government that's representing 7 other councils along a creek. And they're developing what's called the Dandenong Art Creek Trail. Dandenong Creek Art Trail. And one of the 7 councils took leadership to say, actually, let's think about a broader community understanding of this site. And can we work together to develop a framework of values and value to inform local council in their decision-making about what goes into this space. So again, this is sort of busting open whose authority for place and space. And it's a really interesting project that we've been commissioned to do, which will take us through walks along the river with a range of different community groups, in particular traditional custodians of the land, to understand significance. But we wanted to expand engagement with young people and older people to develop some intercultural exchange and storytelling around the site. So we applied for some extra funding with our partners at the council to the Vic Health Association for Health Promotion. And I was really pleased to learn that the way that they fund these projects, which include engagement, youth development, health, physical activity, but also art in public space. And they have a council of young people. They have teenagers who decide who gets funded, which really blows open this question around who decides. So, in many Western countries, it is peer assessment, which I really value in terms of experts in the field of art making decisions. In public art commissioning, it's a little different because you've got commissioners, governments, other types, architectural firms, arts organizations, and a whole range of other kind of stakeholders who have their own particular values and interests. But I've been thinking a lot about this idea of evaluation as a conversation about value and values. And I always go back to this one image from our friend, Thomas Hirschhorn. I don't know if you've seen this one before. Have you seen this? So specter of evaluation, I bring it into my work in terms of thinking about other frameworks that are haunting the arts. So thinking about health frameworks, commercial frameworks, safety frameworks, youth, education, justice, in my space in terms of, art and public space and socially engaged art. But I think, going back to some of Elisa's opening comments, this might be interesting to think about that affair. So is it needing to be a polyamorous affair to engage more than just one relationality? So who is this other and the non-exclusive audience? And how do they pass judgment in a different way than art experts do? So Hirschhorn here, of course, has the green arrow, which is about the work. So it's actually the experience of the work, not the idea, not the value, not the particular sort of intended outcomes and whatnot in the proposal, but the actual experience. I might throw over to Elisa if you've got something to add.
Certainly.
Thanks. That's a super interesting remark. So the way I look at this image by Thomas Hirschhorn, so I say there's two things that I think are important to say. The first is that I think it's a sort of illustration of the distinction between what a philosopher would call the engagement with an artwork as an artwork, so for its value as art, and the kind of engagement that we can have with an artwork for other reasons that might be historical, might be purely political, might be economical, etc., etc., etc. So here, as we see, and I think this is a relevant point Hirschhorn is making, is that if you're making an artwork, it's got to be probably, first of all, an object that you present for being appreciated as art. And that is a public affair. It is not an interaction that is directed only to a public of experts. And then this artifact, like all sorts of objects in the world, since it is embedded in a complex social, political, economical network, and cultural network as well, can happen to embody also different values. And yeah, I said there were two things I wanted to say, but this one is enough. And about that value of an artwork as art rather than its instrumental value in some sense, I think it is relevant to stress that value is probably composite as well. So it's probably composed by intellectual value, because it seems that we value artworks because of the insights they can give us. It's probably also, at least in some cases, an aesthetic value, because we value artworks for the way they engage the senses and the imagination, and the fact that they're capable of arousing pleasure in us in this way. Again, not all artworks have to do this, but this is a possibility. And then there is also socio-political value that might be part of the genuine artistic value of a work and not just of its instrumental value. And this is especially true in the case of all those practices that we group under the term public art. And yeah, well, I will stop here. Otherwise, I will just start commenting on many things that were said before, but that would be confusing, I guess.
Thank you. Eleanor, did you want to respond to that wonderful image as well?
I hadn't seen it before. I had heard Marnie talk about the spectre of measurement, but I didn't think I'd seen the images, and I love it. I think it really compellingly articulates why why those judgment betweens are so fraught and so hard to justify, and because there's so many different perspectives to try and bring together in that process of making judgments between. So no, I love it, and I think it's very helpful to the discussion. But I also, I think in a sense, they help explaining why this becomes also such a challenging problem in the public arena of policy debates and pushing politicians and decision-making people in position of authority to make those decisions. Because whether you go for Marnie's sort of image or for Elisa's very sophisticated articulation of the different ways in which you can look at meaning, work of art, art as having very, you can see how none of the, both bringing either or both of those in policy discussions is really hard, because policy making is a brutal process where complex things get oversimplified, and bringing in nuance and almost a kind of analytical precision that Elisa is inviting us to, to bring to the debate. It's really, really hard. And that's why, in a sense, the winner, what sways opinion, what people put their hopes in the slightly crass basket of, you put £1 in, you get £10 out, are you going to argue with that? Because I think part of the challenge here is the complexity. And whereas as academics, I think the complexity is something that makes it all very exciting to me, because I can see how the image that Marnie brings such an element of richness and sophistication to the attempt to try and understand how judgment happens, and how, why different groups of people can come to reading the same piece of art in completely different ways. That's not going to be very helpful for a policymaker. And I think the challenge is, how do you find some kind of acceptable middle ground where you don't feel you have to resort to the really, really crass instrumental argument, because it's easy to make, it's easy to be understood, and if it's perceived to have rhetorical power, it's persuasive. And how do you avoid the trap of thinking that a policy debate is the same as an academic debate, because it ain't. And I don't know, actually. I think there are some of us in academia who are trying to find a way to bring our expertise in that middle ground. But as somebody who has done that, you mentioned the Warwick Commission. For me, that was, my most consistent attempt to breach those two type of debates around value and how you measure it and how you let it drive policy. It's hard work, and results are tiny compared to the effort and short-lived, because people change roles and the hearts you win over, move on to other jobs eventually, and you have to start from scratch.
I'm good to let Elisa come back to that, and I think Marnie as well wants to come in then as well.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Part of me just wants to say that probably that's how it should be. That the moment you embrace the plurality of values truly, you constantly have this problem of reaching a common ground. So probably public art that is produced in the proper way is public art that is difficult to produce. And I think there is a very strong analogy between the public communication of art and that of science, which is a topic that has been much discussed in recent times for obvious reasons. And I was wondering, of course, I have this tendency of trying to, abstract, to make the most general claim possible. So I was wondering what both of you think about this. So if I were to think of strategies of kinds of strategies for trying to foster the understanding, well, not so much of artworks, but of the reasons we might have to produce public artworks. Well, I would say, I guess there are two broad families of strategies, but maybe there are others that escape my mind. So one would be the very long-term strategy of building an understanding of what public art aims to be among the different stakeholders. And I guess that's the kind of practice you were referring to. And that, I believe, is the kind of practice that will probably never end. And then I think there is the other strategy, which is probably a lot more local and time-bound, and I think probably relates much to Marnie's work. That is the strategy of trying to build up a public, usually, I guess, a very small public, a specific community, while realizing the artwork. So it's not so much about studying this public beforehand, but listening to it and putting together a work whose very structure consists in this dialogue with the public. And so I was wondering what you think about this and whether there are other strategies that you would add to this potential list. Thanks.
Can I jump in?
Yes, go for it.
Great, thank you. And absolutely, Ellie, back to your point about sort of changing rhetoric, policy makers that you've actually, engaged with, because there's a huge amount of knowledge that is lost with that constant shifting of leadership, not just in politicians, but also in cultural bureaucrats as well. There's really specialized and localized knowledges that I think we underestimate. If we use a health promotion framework, social change actually happens when you have political will, paper pushers. And it's such a negative term, I'm sorry if that's offensive to anybody, but the people who actually get things done, actually there's a huge amount of important labor there, and public interest. So, without those three things working together, there's just going to be a lot of conflict and a lot of written reports and evaluations that sit on shelves, including many that I'm sure we've written. So I've actually changed my tactics around how I engage with policy and industry as well. I was going to say, don't tell anyone, but there's 50 people who are listening. But my role now, I see at the university, having a lot of cultural capital that I can share and steal from the institution to give to community and to artists, to do what they want to do. And the other part of that cultural capital is this understanding of policy and evaluative systems, broader kind of research and conceptual frameworks. And I'm often invited to go in and do evaluations for people as an external evaluator, which is like completely in conflict with my own value systems, because I'm not interested in placing value on somebody else's expression of culture and meaning. So a lot of the communities that I'm invited to work with, because I work in art and social justice or community-based practices, are in communities that aren't my own. So not only do I want to resist placing my own value on it, I actually don't understand the cultural value context that I'm working in. So like cultural complexity, I think we have to realize, even with the fish and chips conversation, there's a complexity there that I don't understand. It's not my lived experience. So two really quick examples going in to do evaluation, and I purposely say this idea of going in, because it's not my own community. I only go in when invited. But two dance projects, actually. One, LGBTI plus seniors, a seniors dance club called the Coming Back Out Ball, this incredible, spectacular project, which was around combating social isolation with queer elders, and many people who have to come back out of the closet to go into assisted elder care. And this was a way of people coming together and celebrating their histories and mourning, you know, their predecessors and important leaders in the community, with a particular aesthetic that I'm not familiar with. Which is one of, you know, spectacle and, you know, just all of these wonders that I don't understand. The other was also a dance project with elders, but it was in an Indigenous remote community in the Northern Territory in Australia, and it was called the Indigenous Traditional Dance Project. And here it's an annual three-year cycle of festivals where community is creating sustained connections to country through song and dance, and also not just traditional practice, but contemporary practice as well. And this is a completely different way of understanding place, country, and culture than what I'm familiar with. And in fact, performance is done very differently in that community. You have people singing and playing instruments facing the dancers with their backs towards the audience, because it's about this space in the middle. So everything that I understand about a performance and a viewer or an artwork and an audience is completely different. So the tactic that I take is very much around participatory thinking. So, you know, how do I help create systems and structures with people to be in charge of their own data, their own knowledge, and supporting them to be able to express the meaning and significance of these public art projects, rather than fitting it into a system, which is an evaluation for a policy. It's not actually evaluation in understanding practice better or publics better. It's only ticking boxes in terms of what the policy aims and goals are, which most practices sit completely outside of. There's some alignment, but they have a whole life of their own. So that's my latest tactic, is finding ways to support communities to make sense of their own work. And I think it would be a wonderful project to do around some of these large scale public artworks, to have community groups actually be in charge of communicating value around these works.
Thanks, Marnie. I'd like at this stage to just, at the very least, acknowledge some of the Q&A and the chat that's been happening as well. And there's been some things that we have touched on that have come in, but I think by just looking at the Q&A and the chat, what I've seen is that there's been an emphasis on the actual, I love the expression of bringing in the public earlier, you know, and I think that's probably one thing that has gone unsaid by us, but that is worth kind of reflecting on. And I think that maybe this can come to that issue around time as well, because You know, earlier on you said about, Marnie, was it about, the duration of like 15 years, and at first I was kind of like horrified, but then part of me is like, well, how long can a public last, and public art would need, of course, to be in some way public led, there's another comment as well that's there about, or question about the idea of experimentation, which I think is what you were kind of talking about, Marnie, there as well, which is perhaps worth considering. But perhaps the biggest concern that comes through the questions here is this issue of measurement and evaluating what is successful. And I think time gets to that, and the role of the public gets to that. So both of those two things are there. But when I think of time and measurement of success, I'm obviously thinking of David Hume's famous proposition of like, it's the test of time is the measurement of a good, of a successful work. Did it last? Which is, of course, problematic to say the least. But, we've had these other kind of strange measurements that are being proposed. What was it? The amount of laughs, how many times the statue was touched. A successful statue is one that gets knocked down because it provoked the public, perhaps. Who knows? So maybe, I don't know, who would like to come back on some of the questions and the chat that's kind of coming in? Yes, Eleanor.
Yeah, I think the question of time is interesting, and there was something that came to my mind as both Elisa and Marnie were talking about, and Elisa was, in a sense, asking us to take the long-term perspective of, sort of educating the public and sort of getting, the public to develop a sensitivity and a sense of, what art is. And then Marnie reminded us that actually different public will have very different understandings of value and what a meaningful, significant cultural experience is. And maybe we're going back to the problem of complexity. And I was just also thinking about the broader context in which all of this happens. And certainly in the UK, and what I suspect is happening elsewhere, alongside all the things we've talked about, what has happened is there has been a reduction in the role that arts education has had in school. So part of what makes what both Elisa and Marnie were talking about harder to accomplish is the fact that public education has reduced its commitment to give people, students, access to some of those experiences, to developing the knowledge, the skills, to be prepared to do that kind of long-term work that Elisa was talking about. And so this has had, I think, a ripple effect, because when people interact with public art, or when people think about the role and the place of art in their everyday life, they, young people now have had much fewer opportunities to have those experience, gather those skills, learn to play an instrument, learn, try out being in a play than perhaps, a couple of generations before them. And that means that unless they come from a community who has preserved, its attachment to traditional forms of dance, of music making, of creative practice, for many people, all these things will be no longer part of their everyday experience, and they won't have been primed to think that they should be. So, if you go to school as a kid and one day you do home economics and you learn how to bake a cake because that is a skill that you need for everyday life, and the next day you just do some art because that's a skill that you need in everyday life, if you no longer have that, then it becomes harder, I think, to have a real public conversation around the role and place of art in everyday life and in public spaces. And so I think that's also why the time thing is so challenging, because then then we are, then we will all come to be pushed into the much shorter timeframes of policy making, where quite frankly, the horizon is dictated by the funding cycle. And I know that I always come back to money and who pays for what and why, but I'm a cultural policy person, so that's my job really. So you're not thinking about posterity and what will the judgment of posterity be. Your concern is, what is the judgment of my local arts council person who will assess the quality of this work, because they then will have to decide about whether they fund me again or not. And that compressing down of the time scale means that the impacts that you are going to be looking for, that you can measure and evaluate, are going to be immediate. And I don't think they're necessarily the most meaningful impact, or that they even are impact, because the impact takes a long time. And significance takes a long time to emerge. That's why, usually you say, let posterity judge, because, that's how big value judgments get aid, but that doesn't fit the policy cycle. And that's why you end up with the counting this, counting that, because it's what you can fit into that frame. Whereas what both Marnie and Lisa were talking about were much more fluid, long-term processes of public learning, of experiencing things. And that requires, and even all the stuff around risk and experimentation, you need to have a context where you are allowed to do that. But the current sort of way in which all of this happen and is measured and understood doesn't really allow for that broad approach.
Yes, I entirely agree, but I think Elisa wants to come in on that.
Yeah, briefly, this is related to what Eleonora just said. So in preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about this issue, and I'd like to know what you think about this. So perhaps, at least in the case of some works of public art, we should, be prepared and also accept as a non necessarily negative thing, the fact that perhaps a work might cease at some point to be a work of public art because its public ceases to exist, simply speaking, but it can still remain a pretty good artwork. And so it's part of its value can still appeal to an audience that is, however, not anymore its intended audience. I mean, think about the Parthenon, okay? I guess the Parthenon satisfies the requirements for being described as public art, but definitely its public doesn't exist anymore. And it's also difficult for us to use our imagination to put ourselves in the epistemic position of its public, of its original public, because what we know of 5th century before Christ Greece, is a lot, but it still, I guess, isn't enough. But would you say that that is a kind of artwork that has no value for us, that we cannot appreciate in any way? Well, I wouldn't definitely make this claim, be willing to make this claim. So there seems to be ways in which you can produce art that works as public art for a while, and then is just simply good art. But of course, this doesn't have to apply to all instances of production of public art, even of good public art. And so I think this is an aspect that it might be relevant to take into consideration when one does the very difficult work of bringing a theoretical reflection to the decisional table, so to speak. And
I think that's a good example to think of, because it seems like the work can can shift. And this is again thinking about the kind of the time horizon, funding cycles, and the kind of political decisions that are made. But it's a good example of how a work can perhaps, outlast its public, but then it seems to go from being public art, as you say, to simply being art in the public space, to use Marnie's expression, or art in public space. And it kind of shifts from perhaps being the kind of ideal that we've been kind of considering, which is public-led art, not actually public art. And so we have all of these different ways of conceiving of it. And that today, something like the Parthenon is perhaps not public-led art. It's not public art, but it's actually art in the public space. And it's probably best conceived as like, oh, that's just an outdoor museum effectively at this stage, as opposed to all of these other things that we're requiring around proximity to public that you've described, that we've all kind of described. I mean, Elisa, you begin with that. We know what it's not. It's not something that's inaccessible, and there is something entirely inaccessible about the Parthenon, as you say, epistemologically, to just kind of know what it was, where, and I'm, I don't know, do you want to come in on that, Marnie?
Yeah, just really briefly, the value that we haven't spoken about is the idea of symbolic value, which I think is one of those values that can be interpreted by different people over different periods of time in different ways. It's not one that policymakers are necessarily interested in, unless it's aligned with sort of, nationalist sort of ideals or whatnot. It's not an area that I've explored that deeply, but it's one I think that would be a useful frame for the example you've given, Elisa.
I think that there's a question that's just come in about actually making visible the labor of public art. And I think that might be a good way to think about kind of some of the questions that we brought together. Because yes, how do you get someone to appreciate the value of something? An obvious way is to say, look at the labor and the effort that's required. But for something to be public art, it requires not just the labor of the artist, because that's what art requires, but it requires the labor of the public, that this doesn't count as public art until what, the public have engaged in it over a significant amount of time, in a significant amount of different ways. I'm thinking here about an example actually from Rome that I've done a good bit of work on, which is a statue called the Pasquino, which is a statue that requires the public to actually post satirical poems on it anonymously. And that's how the statue works, and has worked for over 500 years. And so there's that labor isn't simply the production of the material, the fighting for the piece to be in situ or whatever, but it could also be about how people engage with it, how they touch it physically or not, Okay, sorry. Would anybody like to come in on that question or comment really by me?
Hey, Connell, I mean, this isn't a very well thought through thought, because it's just something that came to me as you were talking, so bear with me if it doesn't make complete sense. But I wonder whether one of the challenges we're dealing with is that what public art demands of us, whether we are creators or audiences, is that kind of almost collaborative process of coming together in our different roles and doing our bit, whether it's making the thing or engaging with the thing, and whether in a sense that is difficult because it goes against a big strand of thinking or tradition in Western culture, which is that of the artist as a genius, where the whole point is that we have no idea how the labor of the artist work, what it looks like. We have some heroic notions of the artist in the garret sacrificing his health, because it's a man obviously, for the art, and out of all these mysterious strife, finally the work of art emerges, and then you as an audience just have to sit in awe and admire it. And so in a sense, part of the challenge is that whilst our big traditional, cultural and educational institutions still instill those kind of old values of arts appreciation, understanding the work of art and the genius of the artist, suddenly we plonk things in, on people's everyday route to work, and we expect them to engage in the correct manner and come into this collaborative relationship with the artist. And then Tom Nightingale tells you, but I'd rather have a bag of chips, and we go, oh my god. So I wonder whether, in a sense, we are stuck between a very old traditional set of values and notions, and our desire to have more collaborative ways of engaging with the public. And at the moment, we're kind of stuck in between two worlds. And some of our funding institutions are, the art establishment is still very traditional, but then there's some attempts to challenge that. And I wonder whether some of our difficulties is because we are almost stuck between worlds.
I think that's it. I think it requires a shift from thinking, from what we've been discussing, about the public as being beholders of public art, to actually thinking of the public as being curators of public art. And that's the gap, perhaps. Elisa would like to come in on this.
I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I
Yes.
am a bit skeptical about this, to be honest. So I find it extremely unconvincing to think that the future of art, that art for the present or the future time, has to be art where the artist cannot play the role they have traditionally played. I think the problem is that, as it happens also in other fields, what is damaging often the understanding of art are the oversimplifications of notions that have evolved during the history of art making. So I don't see any conflict between the idea of being able to appreciate the work an artist has done and being able to appreciate a work that has been conceived by that artist as a work that engages the public at some level. So in the end, if I am grasping what the work is, I should be able to bring it back to the fact that someone or a group of people, they could be, many people, a plurality, but those people, they had an idea and they managed to realize it and they managed to make it work. And there is nothing bad about appreciating that aspect of art making. And then if this plurality also in some cases includes the public that has given what qualifies as a genuinely creative contribution, and again, that is an issue that is open to much debate, I believe, well, then there is nothing bad, but we have simply expanded the notion of who qualifies as an artist. And so I don't really see a conflict between words. I see the need, as it often happens, to look into our conceptual tools with much attention. And as it has been remarked several times today, this is extremely difficult when you have to do it with a variety of subjects when you get out of the academic world. But it's also what makes it more interesting, I guess.
Thanks, Elisa. I think that's an important thing not to lose. I wonder, does Marnie want to come in on that?
Yeah, just briefly. Absolutely, I think that public art is a collaboration in a way that some forms of commercial gallery work is not. It's not consumed in the same way. There is a collaboration from the conceptualization of the artist with, from structural engineers to curators to commissioners to local government, to maintenance, to the people who pass by, the people who graffiti it, the people who respond to it, the people who meet in that space. It's another expanded set of negotiations, which I think is exciting for art more broadly. In the public realm, politics isn't really allowed to play out that much anymore, but art is one of those places we still can. And over time, those meanings in politics will change. And I guess coming to one of your final questions, without taking your space, Connell, you had a question about curation, and thinking about the role of the curator originally around caring for artworks, like material objects. In art in public space or art in the public realm, the curator not only has to care for that object, but also the community that is created or attached to it, or that has to receive it, because sometimes they don't have that choice. So that kind of mediation and care for that community is really important, because ultimately they are the hosts of the work. And if there is no hospitality there, it may not be considered to be a successful artwork. But yeah, I like to think about it as this kind of broader, expanded notion of negotiations of values and relationships and collaboration, which is absolutely a form of labor that often doesn't get quantified in policy terms.
Thank you. I think it's time to wrap up, and we'll say thanks to our speakers today, to Eleonora, to Marnie, and Elisa. That was a wonderfully rich chat, and I'm sure many people's heads are fried from all of the terms we've used and so on. But there's a lot more that we could speak about. But thanks for tuning in, everyone, and for the questions and the chat. So there's an hour-and-a-half break now until the next session, which is at 2, and Dr. Nia Van Kelly will chair a session on monuments. So best of luck, everybody. Thank you.